Okay, next we're going to have a conversation about a topic that really, it's very much in the mainstream, but let's not forget it really does impact agriculture, whether that has to do with the labor market or maybe sustaining rural communities in the long term. And that topic is immigration. We're joined right now on radio by Darrell Bricker. He is an author of Empty Planet, great book. I've actually gone through it twice. He's also a pollster and a political commentator. Darrell, how's it going?
Going great. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, doing well. Hey, Darrell, so last week, Maxime Bernier, People's Party of Canada, very much a populism sort of movement in Canada. He recently left, or I guess about a year ago now, left the Conservative Party to go out on his own. And he gave a speech, and there was an article in the Toronto Star covering it, and it really went against a lot of the stuff that the research that you and John Ibbotson, your co-author with Empty Planet, had done. I guess I'll start off here, Darrell. Does Canada have an immigration problem? Because I'm really seeing both sides of the spectrum commentate on Twitter. I'm a little bit confused. How do you break this down? Do we have an immigration problem?
I wouldn't say it's a problem. I would say it's a challenge. And, you know, when you take a look at immigration, if you look at how Canada's population has grown, not just over the last 20 years, but going back to 1867, a lot of it has been driven by immigration. So Canada's had a fairly unique approach in the world to the issue of immigration, in which it's basically been a system of recruitment rather than simply a process of responding to humanitarian crisis, although that's been part of what's happened with our immigration policy over the years. Where we run into a problem is really in two facets. One of them is the actual management of the system. So what we've been seeing over the space of the last 2 or 3 years with the election of Donald Trump and the issues that we've been having at the Canadian border, the Canadian public is rightfully, I would argue, saying to the government, look, if you want to have the ability to expand our immigration numbers, and if you want to claim that you're doing this from the best interests of Canada, you have to be able to manage our border better. So there's probably what I would argue a legitimate series of complaints among Canadians and concerns among Canadians about how that specific issue is being managed. And that's the Canadian border, particularly in the province of Quebec, and there's been a bit in the province of Manitoba. The other issue that is a legitimate discussion is really about the question of integration. So when we take a look at where immigrants are moving in this country, they don't move all over the country. They move principally to our major urban areas. And when you go through a lot of change as a result of different groups of people coming into the population, there needs to be an ongoing conversation with the population that's receiving those folks about the necessity of this and how it actually benefits their community. And instead, what we get from too many politicians these days are bromides about the size of your heart. And quite frankly, that doesn't do anything to help any of this. There has to be a serious conversation with Canadians about why this is essential and why it benefits their communities. And I think governments at all levels have been derelict in doing that.
Well, I sometimes believe that immigration, because we've seen this in the U.S., where I'm not very confident that the Democrats or the Republicans really want to solve any sort of the immigration issue because it's such political fodder. It's fantastic for fundraising. In Canada, I get confused about some of the criticism from the sense that we've even had Donald Trump, President of the United States, talking about how, look at Canada. They have merit-based immigration. That's what we need. And at the same time, we've got Canadians being very critical of the way that we're doing things. There seems to be a lack of understanding about the immigration system overall.
Yeah, and so there is, and the benefits of it. So when you go out and you ask Canadians whether or not immigration has been good for Canada, only about 38% say that it has. So depending on the poll, it's mid-40s down to the mid-30s. Not a majority in any poll that I've seen or done. So obviously there's a big chunk of the Canadian population that remains to be convinced. And what I was talking about a second ago was really the job that governments have of doing that. It's a responsibility if you're going to up our immigration levels to the levels that they are now. I mean, if you really take a look at it, over the last 2 decades, we brought in 2 new Torontos to this country. That's a lot of people, and that's a lot of change. And it's not something that people don't notice. And to the degree that people are uncomfortable with change these days, there's a potential for backlash. which is the reason why the government has to do a better job of both managing the process in the places that it can be managed, but also having that conversation with Canadians as to the benefits of expanding immigration.
I got trapped in one of your tweet threads when you responded to my tweet about the Bernier speech, and one of the arguments that I saw that is from the anti-immigration side is that we need to incentivize current Canadians to have more children because, you know, as the middle class grows and there's more urbanization, I learned in your book Empty Planet that there's a direct correlation to people having less children. So have countries at all, is there any country out there that has had any success in incentivizing its current citizens to have more children?
No. Simple answer. I mean, take a look at all the Nordic countries where they have the most generous parental, maternal leave benefits, the most benefits for people who are having kids, and all of them are below replacement rate. And this is part of the issue that we deal with in the world today, where there is this whole ideological position that's been developed that the global population is out of control, where, you know, the UN comes out and says we're going to reach 11.2 billion people by the end of the century. And you read Empty Planet, and you know that there's a pretty strong argument that that's not going to be the case. In fact, there's more countries struggling right now with the issue of population decline than there are countries that are actually struggling with the issue of populations increasing too much. So places like China and India, for example, China is below population replacement. Now their birth rate's about 1.5. In Canada today it's 1.5. In India it's 2.1. So we have all of these assumptions about all of these countries that are sort of wildly out of control in terms of their birth rate. Applies primarily to Africa, the only place in the world today where this is the case. But even there, every year birth rates continue to drop. So what countries are now struggling with is exactly what you pointed out. You either have to accept that your country is going to age, and an old population is an expensive population, and the population is either shrinking now, and that's okay, or will soon shrink, or you have to invite some process of immigration, because at least in the short to medium term, it's a way to offset the number of kids that you aren't having. And this is the dilemma we're going to be facing, and almost nobody is talking about it.
Well, in defense for the agricultural rural community, there was about a 10-year period where seed biotech companies were promoting the fact that, listen, farmers, we got to produce more. We need to raise our productivity because we need to feed the world. We're going to have 9 billion people by 2050, and we need to do this work. This is our responsibility. And your research completely cut that off, and we've seen those companies drop off of some of that mantra. But the rural communities were really convinced for a good period of time with marketing that this was actually the case. Just give us really quickly, why was that so wrong?
Well, because the UN's targeting, first of all, they're modeling on population increases. I think, you know, in the past has proven to be pretty accurate, but the world has changed so much that relying on what worked in the past is not working for them anymore. So, you know, 11.2 billion is a number that we can all, you know, keep in our mind, or 9 billion by 2050 is a number that we can keep in our mind. And it sounds like, because it's coming from these very credible organizations, that it happens to be true, but it's very likely that it's not. It doesn't mean that the population isn't going to increase until till we get to mid-century, but after that, it's going to start to decline, and it's going to start to decline precipitously. It's the second part of what I just said that most people don't know. They know the first part, but they don't know the second.
Okay, from a rural perspective, you know, rural communities there's a struggle out there trying to keep, you know, the hospital, trying to keep the school. You need people to be able to justify having that infrastructure. Immigration is one of the ways that a small rural community can stay alive, so to speak. Why does there seem to be a bit of a disconnect on facts like, or on theories like that?
Well, the thing about living in rural and agricultural communities is that if you want to keep them alive, then you need the immigrants from the turn of the last century, not the turn of this century. So, you know, we're asking people who have no experience with farming, you know, people who come from urban areas. The people that we recruit to Canada are coming in with, you know, engineering degrees, and they're coming in, you know, with software skills and that kind of thing. They're not farmers. They're coming from the Philippines, they're coming from India, and they're coming from China. They're not people who are used to farming in this kind of climate. If they ever farmed at all. So what they do is they go to where people from their community already are, where they have family members potentially, and that's to our largest urban areas. And so, for example, the foreign-born population of Canada today, so where immigrants settle, is all, over 90% in the major cities. So the problem that we have is that we're not attracting immigrants who actually want to go to those climates that are, northern climates to farm. They don't have the skills to do it. They're not coming from countries in which that's the case. And the idea of sending them to rural communities to populate them is really asking them to make a really major change in everything that brought them to the country. So, if you've got Clifford Sifton back at the turn of the last century, when you're recruiting people from the Russian steppes to populate the, prairie farm communities, that makes sense. When you're bringing them in from Shanghai, it doesn't.
Okay, so who decides, under a merit-based system like we have, who decides on that criteria in terms of what skills are needed? Is there a review board? Or because, if that's the case, agriculture needs to maybe step up a little bit and make sure that the body or whoever is responsible understands that, we've got some skill gaps here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's the engineering industry, the mining industry. There's all sorts of groups of the Canadian economy that are in that situation. And obviously the place that you would go is the federal government, because they're the ones that manage it everywhere except in the province of Quebec.
Yeah. For the anti-immigration crowd, have we blurred the line? But we get confused that immigration is not immigration. That there's refugees, there's illegal immigrants, and there's people that go through the proper system. Have we blurred that line and put everybody in the same bucket? And that's what's one of the reasons why we can't necessarily have an intellectual conversation about this.
Totally, and it's both sides that have done it. So, the anti-immigration crowd focuses on the people who are breaking the rules and, coming into the country and saying, well, this is, what immigration is in this country. It is not. And then on the other side of it, you've got, the Prime Minister showing up at the airport with the Premier of Ontario at the time of the Syrian refugee crisis, putting coats on kids. Well, that's not our immigration situation either. I mean, around 10% of our entire immigrant intake every year is refugees. Almost all of the immigration that we bring in are economic migrants, people who we basically recruit to support the Canadian economy and keep our population growing. Nobody's having that conversation.
In putting out the book, Darrell, I know you've been getting, you and John Ibbotson, your co-author, writer for the Globe and Mail, have been getting a lot of international recognition for the book. What is the global view on Canada's system of immigration?
Well, first of all, nobody really knows. So, when you're, as we did in the book, talk about immigration, Canadian immigration, and what we think is a pretty reasonable approach to managing immigration, particularly compared to what we're seeing in other countries. It's new information for most people. Most of the negative, and actually, it's not even negative. It's most of actually legitimate criticism from people who actually do understand this issue. Is they say to us two things. The first thing is you don't understand the test of tolerance this is in our country. In other words, if I'm living in Japan, or I'm living in Germany, or I'm living in a place that has a very well-established culture and is not one that, Germany being a bit of an exception, that has really seen a lot of cultural change as a result of immigration, you don't know what you're asking our population to accept. And the other outcome that goes along with that is that this immigration is one of the biggest drivers of populism in the world, particularly right-wing populism. So, asking asking our country to absorb more immigrants, you don't understand the political peril that you're potentially causing. So there's been a couple of critics that have said that, and I think, we're really clear about this in the book, but they missed that point. We actually say that Canada may be unique in its ability to manage this, but, we shouldn't take it for granted. The second criticism, and it's another legitimate criticism, is you don't understand how quickly the flow of immigrants that you feel is going to save various countries, how that flow of immigrants is going to start becoming constricted. Because immigration is a young person's game. And the places that a lot of the immigration come from, which in Canada, principally from Pacific nations, they're aging as rapidly, if not more rapidly than Canada. So, for example, China, which is our third source of immigrants right now, used to be our number one source, it's number three source. The median age of a person in China today is 39. Those aren't immigrating years. When you get to 39, you're probably fairly settled as to where you're going to stay. So in Canada, the median age is 41. And China's aging more rapidly than Canada is. So some of these places are going to run out of immigrants. There's actually going to be, for the countries that can figure out how to work this, a competition for immigration. So even though we suggest that immigration is a potential solution to the issue of population decline, both John and I acknowledge that it's a temporary situation. It's a temporary solution. It's a mid-century solution. After that, it's going to get harder and harder to find the quality type of immigrants we want to have come to the country.
Oh, that's fascinating. There's like a constricted supply long term of immigrants. That is fascinating. Hey, last question here, Darrell. We got a federal election coming up here in the fall. Can we expect immigration to be a big election issue? And if so, what's actually different about the way the parties approach it?
Well, what's different this time is that the real big fight on immigration the last time was over level of compassion. Although I should caution people who are listening who think that immigration was a big driver of how people voted in the last election. It really wasn't. So it was really sort of the Liberals, an opportunity for them to demonstrate compassion. Actually, when we were doing surveys at the time, the public actually preferred the Conservatives' approach to immigration and managing the Syrian refugee crisis. So, it's a bit of a mixed bag last time around. This time around, the events at the Quebec border have created, I would say, some significant kindling that somebody could light. I don't think the person who's capable of lighting it in any meaningful political way is Maxime Bernier. If the Liberals decide that they're going to use it as an opportunity to push back against the Conservatives in terms of their tolerance of difference and minorities, and this extends even to the majority. By that I mean women in Canadian society. So their tolerance of various politics related to people's identity, that could become a bit of an issue. And if the Tories, particularly if there's a mad rush at the border during the course of the next election because of something that happens in the United States, the Tories can probably point at that and say, one more example of the Liberals not particularly managing this issue. So if it comes up as an issue in the campaign, it will probably be around that.
Interesting stuff. Hey, Darrell, thank you very much for joining us. I look forward to the next time we get a chance to chat about this topic and more.
Love it. Thank you very much.
Hope you enjoyed my discussion with Darrell Bricker, co-author of Empty Planet. Great book. I so encourage you to check it out, no matter how you feel about the immigration issues in Canada. No matter what side you're on, I encourage you to read it. Fantastic read, well-researched, awesome stuff, and really appreciate Darrell Bricker joining us here on the show.